People who know me know how fiercely protective I am of the people I love.
Losing my little brother, there's nothing like.
I've been struggling for a long time, and I just needed a break.
I'm so sorry. I have to be honest with you. I'm getting a bikini wax right now.
Absolutely did not expect it would be that long.
The time can also make you think differently and ask different questions.
Look out!
But I felt like used alcohol as medicine.
It was within days, I basically just like ballooned.
For almost her entire life, Hayden Panettiere was being watched. She was appearing on television before she was old enough to understand what fame even meant. We watched her grow up. We watched her become a movie star, a cheerleader who couldn't die, a country singer fighting to hold herself together, a woman whose face had been familiar for decades, and yet, perhaps we never really knew her.
Like, people who know me know how fiercely protective I am of the people I love.
Because behind the premieres, the photographs, and the characters, Hayden was fighting battles the audience couldn't see. Addiction, postpartum depression, painful relationships, the devastating death of her younger brother, and the strange reality of trying to discover who you are when you've been performing for other people since childhood.
And the question has been from my friends, like, why are you not as protective of yourself as you are of everybody else?
Then, in May 2026, Hayden did something different. She released a memoir called This Is Me, A Reckoning. After spending most of her life having other people tell her story, Hayden was finally telling it herself. She spoke about the past, about motherhood, about addiction, about mistakes, about survival, and remarkably, she was also talking about the future.
And I sit there and go, I mean, you're right. I don't know. I guess I was just not taught to do that.
There were still things she wanted to do, still chapters she believed were ahead of her. Then, on August 16th, 2026, Hayden Panettiere was found unresponsive in South Carolina. She was pronounced dead at the scene. She was just 36 years old. Authorities began an investigation, and at the time of this documentary, her official cause of death has not been released.
I'm so grateful that I have the relationship I have with my daughter now. I mean, I travel as much as I can to be with her.
Almost immediately, the headlines began. Questions, speculation, people trying to understand what had happened. But maybe, if Hayden's story ends with the circumstances of her death, we've missed a story she had only just begun trying to tell us.
Me the other day, calls me Brittany. She called me Brittany, and I'm like sitting there going, what is she talking about? And I was like, oh my gosh, bring it on. She's watching Bring It On now.
Because long before Heroes, long before Nashville, long before the world knew about the struggles behind the smile, there was simply a little girl who entered show business before she could possibly have known what it might eventually ask from her. And to understand Hayden Panettiere, that's where we need to begin.
I mean, he was my only sibling, and he was my younger sibling, and it was my job to protect him. And
Hayden Panettiere didn't really choose a moment to enter show business, because by the time most children were learning how to walk, Hayden was already working. She began appearing in commercials before her first birthday. Think about that for a moment. Before Hayden could understand what a camera was, cameras were already pointed at her. Before she understood fame, performance was already becoming part of her life.
When I lost him, I felt like I lost half of my soul.
And by around 5 years old, Hayden had moved into television. She appeared in One Life to Live, and later became Lizzie Spaulding on Guiding Light. This wasn't a child occasionally appearing on television. Hayden was learning lines, hitting marks, performing emotional scenes, working alongside adults, in an industry built around schedules, ratings, and deadlines. And she was remarkably good at it.
Don't ever expect me to get over the loss of him.
After Hayden's death, one of her Guiding Light co-stars remembered just how unusually capable she had been as a child performer, handling enormous amounts of dialogue and emotionally demanding material at an incredibly young age.
No matter how many years go by, he will always be beside me, and it will always be, I will always be heartbroken about it.
But there's another side to being that good, that young, When adults constantly praise you for performing, when work becomes normal before childhood has really begun, where does a performer end and the child begin?
Time does heal things, but time can also make you think differently and ask different questions.
Hayden would spend much of her life trying to answer questions like that, but at the time, her career was accelerating.
I don't feel confident enough to, but if I don't go out and if I don't keep moving, then I'm never gonna move away from.
In 1998, she became the voice of Dot in Pixar's A Bug's Life. The work even contributed to a Grammy nomination connected to the film's children's spoken word album.
I said finally, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I have to be honest with you, I'm getting a bikini wax right now. And
Then
I thought I
came
could
the
do
role that made a much larger audience notice her. Remember the Titans. Hayden played Cheryl Yost, the football-obsessed daughter of Coach Bill Yost. She was only around 11, acting alongside performers including Denzel Washington and
For the
Will Patton.
Titans.
What do you want? That wasn't a hole! Oh, come on, that was such a bad call!
And Hayden didn't disappear into the background. She had presence, confidence, attitude, that strange ability some child actors possess, where they don't seem like a child trying to act. They simply seem natural. More roles followed. Raising Helen, Tiger Cruise, Ice Princess, Bring It On, All or Nothing. Hayden was becoming one of those young faces audiences felt they'd always known. But that's the strange thing about child stars. We watch them grow and begin believing we know them. We see their childhood photographs, their teenage years, their relationships, their careers, their mistakes. But we're seeing a person through a screen.
I'd been struggling for a long time, and I just needed a break.
And Hayden would later
ended up-
speak openly about the difficulties that came with growing up that way, including struggles with identity and the pressures attached to spending so much of childhood in the entertainment industry. Because while most teenagers are quietly trying to work out, who am I? Hayden was doing it, while millions of strangers were beginning to form their own answer.
the amount of time, and I definitely, absolutely did not expect it would be that long.
And
Panettiere
then,
now-
in 2006, everything became much bigger. Hayden was cast as a teenage cheerleader named Claire Bennet in a strange new television series about ordinary people discovering extraordinary abilities. Claire had one particularly useful ability. She could heal again and again and again, and suddenly one phrase was everywhere: save the cheerleader, save the world.
And there was nobody there that was really able to support me in the way that I needed
The show
to
was
be
called
supported.
Heroes.
And I don't like to ask
And
for help
at just
either.
17 years old,
You know, I wanna
Hayden
be-
Panettiere was about to become internationally famous. But there was something almost haunting about the character that made her a star. Claire Bennet could be hurt, broken, thrown down, and somehow she always healed. For Hayden Panettiere, real life would prove much more complicated. In 2006, Hayden Panettiere was 17 years old. She had already spent almost her entire life working. But Heroes was different. This wasn't another childhood role. This was the moment Hayden Panettiere became a star. She played Claire Bennet, an ordinary high school cheerleader with an extraordinary secret. Claire could heal. Cut her, she healed. Break her bones, they repaired themselves. She could survive things that should
for
have killed
years,
her.
suddenly on the floor in a puddle of mess and alcohol, you got to know something's wrong.
And then came
Panettiere-
6 words that seemed to appear everywhere: save the cheerleader, save the world. Heroes became a phenomenon, and Hayden's face became one of the images most closely associated with it. Suddenly, the little girl who had grown up in commercials and soap operas was internationally famous. Magazine covers, interviews, red carpets, photographers, fans. Everywhere Hayden went, people knew who she was, and she was still a teenager. That's worth remembering, because when we look back at celebrity photographs, everybody appears older somehow, more certain, more prepared.
Red carpet, I was like lively and like totally down to answer the questions and a chatterbox.
But Hayden was 17. At an age when most people are still discovering who they are, the world had already decided who Hayden Panettiere was. The beautiful blonde cheerleader from Heroes and success brought opportunities. Films followed, music, endorsements. Hayden became the face of major advertising campaigns. She wasn't simply an actress anymore. She was a brand. But being marketable and being understood are two very different things.
I did grow up around people that I felt like, I didn't realize till later, but I felt like used alcohol as medicine.
Hayden later spoke about being boxed into certain roles because of how people saw her, the blonde, the popular girl, the cheerleader. And perhaps that's one of the strangest things about becoming famous so young. Millions of people begin recognizing you before you've had the chance to recognize yourself. After Heroes ended in 2010, Hayden faced something almost every young star eventually confronts. What happens next? Because surviving childhood fame doesn't guarantee an adult career. Audiences grow up, television changes, Hollywood finds another young face, and suddenly, the person who had been working since infancy needed to prove herself again. Hayden appeared in Scream 4 as Kirby Reed, a sharp, funny, horror-obsessed character who became a fan favorite. But then, in 2012, came the role that would reveal something audiences hadn't fully seen before. Hayden could sing, she could carry drama, and she could portray a character far darker and more complicated than Claire Bennet. Her name was Juliette Barnes. The series was Nashville. Hayden played a young country superstar, ambitious, talented, successful, emotionally wounded, and desperately trying to keep control of a life that was beginning to unravel. The performance earned Hayden 2 Golden Globe nominations. On the surface, it looked like the perfect transition. Child actor, teenage star, adult actress. Hayden had survived the part of Hollywood, where so many young careers disappear. But then something deeply unsettling began happening. The story Hayden was performing on television started resembling a life she was living away from it. Years later, Hayden would explain that Nashville began touching subjects she herself was struggling with: difficult family relationships, alcohol, addiction, and eventually, postpartum depression. The similarities became so intense. Hayden said she reached a point where she struggled to tell where Juliette ended and Hayden began. Think about what that must have meant. Hayden would arrive on set carrying something painful from her real life. The cameras would turn on, and she would be asked to perform a version of it. Then someone would call cut. But unlike Juliette Barnes, Hayden couldn't simply leave the storyline behind, because the darkest chapter of her life wasn't happening in the script anymore. It was happening to her. For years, Hayden Panettiere had played characters who survived. Claire Bennet could literally heal herself. Juliette Barnes could fall apart, and eventually, the writers could give her another episode. But Hayden didn't have writers, and real life didn't reset when the credits rolled. In December 2014, Hayden became a mother. She and her then-fiancé, former heavyweight boxing champion Vladimir Klitschko, welcomed their daughter, Kaya. For Hayden, this should have been one of the happiest chapters of her life. Instead, it became one of the most difficult. After a traumatic birth, Hayden experienced severe postpartum depression, and she would later describe something many people still misunderstand. Postpartum depression didn't mean she didn't love her daughter. It didn't mean she wanted to hurt her. Hayden said she didn't. What she described was something much harder to explain. The color seemed to disappear from life. She felt disconnected, anxious, unable to understand why something that was supposed to bring enormous happiness could leave her feeling so empty. And then Hayden began trying to escape those feelings. Alcohol increasingly became part of that escape. Then alcohol became something she relied upon, and the substances that had already complicated parts of her life became increasingly difficult to control. But every morning, there was still work, still makeup, still scripts, still Nashville, and waiting inside those scripts was Juliette Barnes, a woman struggling with motherhood, postpartum depression, alcohol, addiction, relationships falling apart. Hayden later said that initially, she thought the similarities between Juliette's story and her own life were coincidence. Then the parallels kept coming, again and again, until acting stopped feeling like escape. Hayden said she reached a point where she couldn't tell where Juliette began and Hayden ended. Imagine having one of the worst days of your life, then arriving at work, opening a script, and discovering you're expected to perform something frighteningly similar. The camera rolls. You cry. You break down. You perform the pain. Then somebody says, cut. Everybody goes home. Except Hayden couldn't leave the story on set because she was still living it. Eventually, she sought treatment. In 2015, Hayden publicly acknowledged that she was experiencing postpartum depression at a time when the condition was still surrounded by misunderstanding. A famous young actress stood in front of millions of people and admitted, "I'm struggling." Years later, Hayden revealed there had been consequences she hadn't expected from speaking so openly. But something mattered more. She had said it out loud, and women watching at home who were experiencing something similar suddenly knew they weren't the only ones. But speaking about the problem didn't make Hayden's problems disappear. Her struggle with alcohol and opioids continued. Treatment followed, then relapse, then another attempt at recovery. Her relationship with Vladimir deteriorated, and eventually, Hayden faced perhaps the most painful decision of her life. In 2018, Kaya went to live with her father in Europe. Hayden would later speak about that period with enormous emotion. From the outside, people could judge, and some did. But Hayden said she believed her daughter needed stability at a time when she couldn't provide enough of it herself. It meant being separated from the person she loved most because she believed that person deserved something Hayden wasn't capable of giving her at that moment. Years later, she would describe a heartbreak of parenting across enormous distance. Phone calls, FaceTime, visits, watching your child grow from another part of the world. And underneath all of it was addiction. Hayden later described a cycle where she would believe she'd reached the bottom only to discover there was somehow further to fall. Her health deteriorated, her career slowed, relationships fractured, and the young woman who had spent almost her entire life appearing in front of cameras began disappearing from them. But perhaps the cruelest part was that Hayden understood exactly what was happening. She knew substances were destroying parts of her life. She knew what she was losing. She knew she needed help. And still, knowing wasn't always enough. Because addiction doesn't disappear simply because someone understands the consequences. Hayden would eventually become brutally honest about that. Not to make excuses, not to rewrite the past, but because she wanted people to understand that behind the photographs, behind the fame, behind the beautiful young actress people thought had everything, was someone desperately struggling to find her way back. And eventually, Hayden reached a frightening point. Her body began telling her what perhaps she hadn't been ready to hear. Something had to change, because this was no longer simply about Hayden's career, or her reputation, or whether Hollywood would welcome her back. This had become about something far more basic, whether Hayden Panettiere was going to survive. For a while, Hayden Panettiere disappeared. Not completely, but from the Hollywood machine, the premieres, the television schedules, the constant expectation to perform. After Nashville ended in 2018, Hayden stepped away from acting for roughly 4 years. And this time, she wasn't trying to find the next big role. She was trying to find herself. Years later, Hayden would explain why that time away had been necessary. She needed to work on her physical health, her mental health, her spiritual health. For someone who had been performing since she was a baby, perhaps doing nothing publicly was one of the most radical things she could do. There were no characters to hide inside, no scripts, no call sheets, no cameras waiting for Hayden Panettiere to become somebody else. She had to confront Hayden, and recovery wasn't instant. There were years of treatment, difficult decisions, consequences, relationships that had become painful, and a body that had endured more than most people watching from the outside realized. But eventually, something began returning, hope. And strangely enough, the character who helped bring Hayden back was someone audiences thought they'd already lost, Kirby Reed. In 2011, Hayden had played Kirby in Scream 4. Funny, sarcastic, smart, a horror movie obsessive who became a fan favorite. At the end of the film, Kirby's fate had been left uncertain. For years, fans wondered whether she'd survived. And apparently, so did Hayden. When the Scream franchise returned, Hayden decided she wanted Kirby back too. She didn't simply wait for Hollywood to call. She called them. Hayden later joked that she had practically willed Kirby back into existence. And in 2023, after 4 years away from acting, Hayden Panettiere returned to the screen in Scream 6. There's something almost perfect about the role she chose. Kirby Reed was a survivor, A character everyone had once assumed was dead, who suddenly appeared again. Older, scarred, different, but alive. Hayden understood that character differently now, because she had scars too, and for the first time in years, acting felt exciting again. Hayden said returning to Scream felt like coming home. The familiar world, the fans who had never forgotten Kirby, the feeling of being on a set again. Maybe this could be the beginning of something new. Not the child actor, not the cheerleader from Heroes, not Juliette Barnes, not the woman reduced to headlines about everything that had gone wrong. Just Hayden Panettiere, starting again. And then, only weeks before Scream 6 reached cinemas, Hayden received a phone call that changed everything. Her younger brother, Jansen Panettiere, was dead. He was only 28 years old. Jansen had also acted, but he was an artist too. He painted, he drew, he created, and more importantly, he was Hayden's little brother. The two had been extremely close. His death was sudden. His family later revealed that Jansen had died from complications related to an enlarged heart. There was no warning that could have prepared Hayden for losing him, and the timing was devastating. She had fought her way back. She was returning to acting. She was promoting a major film. She was supposed to be talking about the future. Instead, she was grieving. During an interview promoting Scream 6, Hayden was offered condolences for Jansen. She touched her chest and quietly explained that her brother was right there with her. It was a tiny moment, but you could see this wasn't celebrity grief. There was no performance required. This was simply a sister missing her brother. And grief doesn't care whether you're rebuilding. It doesn't wait until you're strong enough. It arrives and changes the shape of everything. Hayden later spoke about just how profoundly Jansen's death affected her. The person she had known almost his entire life was suddenly gone. And once again, Hayden was being asked to survive something she never wanted to experience. But she kept moving. She kept working. She kept talking. And increasingly, she stopped pretending the scars weren't there. Maybe that was the biggest change. Young Hayden had spent years being presented as polished, beautiful, successful, the child star who grew up, the cheerleader, the actress, the celebrity. Older Hayden seemed less interested in pretending life had been perfect. She had survived addiction, postpartum depression, broken relationships, separation from her daughter, career uncertainty, and now the death of her brother. Those experiences had changed her, but Hayden was beginning to realize that perhaps she didn't need to hide what they'd left behind. She could talk about them. She could own them. She could tell people, this happened to me, and perhaps someone else wouldn't feel quite so alone. Hayden began talking about the importance of forgiveness, of learning to love yourself, of being gentler with the person staring back at you in the mirror. She also began looking beyond acting, producing, directing, developing projects herself, not simply being the person standing in front of the camera, but becoming someone who could help decide what the camera was pointed at. For perhaps the first time in Hayden Panettiere's life, she wasn't simply waiting for somebody else to give her the next script. She was beginning to imagine writing the next chapter herself. And eventually, she decided that if she was going to do that, she would have to tell the truth about the chapters that came before it. All of them. The beautiful ones, the painful ones, the ones she regretted, and the ones she had spent years trying to survive. Hayden Panettiere had spent almost her entire life playing characters written by other people. Now, she was finally ready to tell us who Hayden really was. For almost her entire life, other people had been telling Hayden Panettiere's story. Directors told her where to stand. Writers gave her the words. Magazines chose the photographs. Headlines decided which parts of her life the public would see. Child star, cheerleader, actress, mother, addict, survivor, celebrity. But in 2026, Hayden decided she wanted to tell the story herself. She called it This Is Me, A Reckoning. And even the title felt important. Not, This is Claire Bennet. Not, This is Juliette Barnes. Not, This is the Hayden Panettiere you think you know. Just, This is me. The memoir wasn't a polished attempt to pretend everything had worked out perfectly. Hayden wrote about things that were uncomfortable, painful, complicated. She wrote about growing up in Hollywood before she was old enough to understand what Hollywood could take from you. She wrote about addiction, postpartum depression, motherhood, relationships, recovery, her brother Jansen. and the decisions she had made that she knew people might judge. For decades, Hayden's life had been reduced to headlines. Now, she was adding the parts the headlines couldn't contain. And perhaps one of the most important things about this period was that Hayden wasn't only looking backward, she was looking forward. She talked about producing, directing, writing, creating projects herself. She wanted more control over the stories she told and the environments in which those stories were made. After spending a lifetime as a child, then the woman standing in front of somebody else's camera, Hayden was beginning to imagine standing behind it. She also talked about wanting the entertainment industry to become safer for young performers, because Hayden knew something about child stardom that very few people could understand. She hadn't studied it. She hadn't observed it. She had lived it. She knew what it meant to become professional before becoming an adult, to have adults depending on you, to have strangers recognize you, to have your appearance discussed, your relationships discussed, your mistakes discussed, and eventually your pain discussed. Maybe Hayden couldn't change what growing up that way had done to her, but perhaps she could make things different for the child who came after her. That became part of what she wanted her experiences to mean. Not simply, look what happened to me, but what can we learn from it? And there was somebody else. Hayden hoped would one day understand the full story. Her daughter, Kaya. Hayden knew that parts of the memoir would be difficult for her daughter to read. There were decisions, pain, and years of separation that couldn't be explained with a simple sentence. But Hayden wanted Kaya to eventually understand the woman behind those decisions. Not a perfect mother, not a perfect person. Her mother, a woman who had struggled, a woman who had made mistakes, a woman who had loved her, even during the years when loving her meant making decisions that broke Hayden's own heart. And when Hayden spoke publicly about the book, something else began appearing in those conversations. Hope. Not the kind of hope where somebody pretends a past didn't happen. Hayden wasn't doing that. She carried the scars. She knew they were there, but she had begun talking about them without seeming to believe they made her less worthy of a future. Hayden had a phrase for the enormous events that shake your life apart. Life quakes. Those moments when everything changes. When the life you thought you were living suddenly doesn't exist anymore. Hayden had experienced more than her share. Addiction, motherhood, recovery, separation, violence, the loss of her brother. Each one had changed her, but perhaps Hayden had reached a point where she no longer wanted to erase the evidence. The scars weren't proof that she had failed. They were proof that something had happened and she was still here. During the months surrounding the memoir, Hayden spoke about wanting her experiences to help other people. People approached her and told her that hearing her talk openly about postpartum depression, addiction, or survival had helped them, and Hayden understood what that meant. Maybe telling the truth could become useful. Maybe somebody sitting at home, believing they were the only person feeling that way, would hear Hayden Panettiere say, "I've been there too," and feel slightly less alone. At a book event in May 2026, Hayden spoke about the kind of legacy she hoped to leave. She wanted, in her own words, to leave the world a better place than she found it. There's something painfully different about hearing those words now, because Hayden wasn't speaking like someone preparing to say goodbye. Quite the opposite. She was making plans, thinking about new creative projects, talking about directing, producing, writing, about motherhood, about the woman she was still becoming. She believed there was more ahead. After a lifetime of other people writing scripts for Hayden Panettiere, she finally seemed ready to write one for herself. And perhaps that's what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend. Because This Is Me, A Reckoning didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, a woman looking backward so she could finally move forward. A woman saying, "These are my scars. These are my mistakes. This is what happened. This is what I survived. And this is me." Hayden Panettiere had spent almost 36 years trying to understand the life she'd already lived. And in the spring of 2026, she was still talking about the life she wanted to live next. She couldn't have known that only months later, the world would return to those interviews, those words, and that book, looking for something, anything, that might explain what happened next. But perhaps we need to be careful, because Hayden had spent enough of her life having strangers decide what her story meant. And if we turn her final months into clues surrounding her death, we risk doing exactly the same thing again. Maybe the more important thing is to listen to what Hayden was actually telling us. While she was here, she wasn't saying, "This is how my story ends." She was saying, "This is who I am." There was supposed to be more acting, more producing, more directing, more writing, more time with her daughter, more opportunities to take everything Hayden Panettiere had learned and decide for herself what came next. She was only 36 years old, and everything Hayden had been saying publicly suggested she believed there were still chapters ahead. Then came August 16th, 2026. Hayden was staying in Greenville, South Carolina. At approximately 1:50 in the afternoon, emergency services were called to a residence. After Hayden was found unresponsive, first responders arrived. They began advanced life support measures and tried to resuscitate her, but they couldn't bring her back. At 2:32 p.m., Hayden Panettiere was pronounced dead. She was 36. Almost immediately, the questions began. How? Why? What happened? Dispatch communications from the emergency response referred to a possible overdose and cardiac arrest. But those words are not the same thing as an official cause of death. An autopsy was performed the following day. The coroner reported there were no signs of trauma contributing to Hayden's death. Authorities also said there was no indication of foul play, but at the time the story is being told, the official cause and manner of Hayden Panettiere's death have not been determined. Further testing and investigation are still underway, and that matters because Hayden spent much of her life having strangers speculate about her appearance, her relationships, her health, her motherhood, her mistakes, her recovery. Perhaps the last thing we should do is turn the final hours of her life into another story. Before we actually know what happened, there will be time for facts when the facts exist. But there is already something we know for certain. Hayden expected there to be more. Only months earlier, she had released the most personal account of her life. She was talking about new projects, about directing, producing, writing, about helping young performers, about her daughter, about the person she was still trying to become. This wasn't someone presenting her memoir as the final chapter. Hayden was trying to begin another one, and that's perhaps what makes her death so difficult to process. Because when somebody dies young, we don't only grieve the life they lived, we grieve the life they didn't get to live, the films that were never made, the conversations that never happened, the birthdays that never arrived, the ordinary mornings that suddenly became impossible. And for Hayden, there was something particularly cruel about that. She had already spent so much of her life trying to survive difficult chapters. She had been famous almost from infancy. She had experienced addiction, postpartum depression, painful relationships, separation, recovery, the devastating loss of her brother. And still, she was talking about tomorrow. After her death, tributes began appearing from people who had known Hayden across different chapters of her life. Co-stars, friends, people who remembered the child actor, the teenager from Heroes, the woman from Nashville, the survivor who returned in Scream 6. Different people remembering different Haydens. And perhaps that's appropriate, because Hayden Panettiere had spent almost her entire life in front of us. We watched her grow. We watched her succeed. We watched her struggle. And sometimes we watch far too closely. But visibility isn't the same thing as understanding. Knowing someone's films isn't knowing them. Reading their interviews isn't knowing them. Seeing photographs of their worst moments certainly isn't knowing them. And maybe that's what Hayden had finally begun trying to explain. This is me, not the headlines, not the rumors, not Claire Bennet, not Juliette Barnes, not Kirby Reed. Me, Hayden, a daughter, a sister, a mother, an actress, a woman who made mistakes, a woman who experienced enormous pain, a woman who kept trying to understand herself, and a woman who believed there was still more time. Maybe one day, the investigation will tell us precisely what happened on August 16th, and when it does, that information will become part of Hayden Panettiere's story. But it should never become the whole story, because Hayden's life lasted almost 37 years, not one afternoon. And if we're going to remember her, perhaps we owe her something better than reducing everything she was to the way she died. There was supposed to be more. Tragically, There wasn't, but there's still one chapter left for us to tell. Not about how Hayden Panettiere died, but about what she left behind. For almost 36 years, Hayden Panettiere lived much of her life. In front of us, we saw the little girl, the child actor, the teenager, the cheerleader, the country singer, the movie star. We watched Hayden grow up without ever really stopping to ask what growing up that way might have been like for her. Because that's the strange thing about fame. Being seen isn't the same as being known. Millions of people knew Hayden Panettiere's face. They knew Claire Bennet, Juliette Barnes, Kirby Reed. They knew the photographs, the relationships, the headlines, and eventually they knew about the struggles, addiction, postpartum depression, recovery, motherhood, grief. But those things weren't Hayden. They were things that happened to Hayden. And perhaps that's the distinction. She spent the final chapter of her life trying to make us understand. Hayden wasn't asking people to pretend she'd lived a perfect life. Quite the opposite. She talked about the mistakes, the pain, the decisions she regretted, the things she wished she could have done differently. She allowed us to see the scars, but she didn't seem to believe those scars were the end of her story. In fact, she seemed to believe they were finally becoming part of something useful. Because when Hayden talked openly, other people listened. Mothers experiencing postpartum depression heard someone say, "I felt this too." People struggling with addiction saw somebody famous admit that fame didn't make recovery easy. People carrying mistakes from their past saw a woman trying to forgive the person she'd once been. And Hayden discovered that telling the truth about your pain could sometimes help somebody else understand theirs. Perhaps that's why This Is Me, A Reckoning matters so much now. Hayden had spent almost her entire life speaking words written by somebody else. Then finally, she gave us her own, not because she believed her story was finished, but because she believed there was more to come. That's what makes this ending so difficult. Hayden wasn't looking backward because she'd given up on tomorrow. She was trying to make peace with yesterday so she could reach it. There were projects she wanted to create, stories she wanted to tell, a daughter she loved, people she wanted to help, and a life she was still trying to understand. Then, suddenly, there was no more time. And now, the temptation will be to look backward for clues, to examine every interview, every photograph, every difficult moment, and ask, did we miss something? Maybe we did, but perhaps not in the way we think. Maybe what we missed wasn't some hidden clue explaining how Hayden Panettiere died. Maybe we missed Hayden, the human being, underneath everything we thought we knew. Because Claire Bennet could heal from anything, Hayden couldn't. Juliette Barnes could reach the end of an episode and wait for the writers to decide what happened next. Hayden couldn't. Kirby Reed could survive the horror and return for another movie. But Hayden was human. She could be hurt. She could make mistakes. She could fall. She could recover. She could fall again. And she could keep trying. Maybe that's a Hayden Panettiere worth remembering. Not somebody who conquered every struggle. Not somebody whose life can be wrapped up with a perfect Hollywood ending. But somebody who kept trying to understand herself, even when doing so was painful. Somebody who eventually looked at the darkest parts of her own story and decided, I'm going to talk about them because maybe somebody needs to hear this. Hayden once played a girl the entire world was told it needed to save the cheerleader, save the world. Nearly 20 years later, that line feels very different because behind the indestructible girl was a very real woman trying to save herself. And maybe we never completely knew her. Maybe nobody watching from the outside ever could, but before she left, Hayden Panettiere finally tried to introduce us. She didn't call that story, This Is Who I Was. She called it, This Is Me. And perhaps, if we really want to remember Hayden, it's time we listened.